Hello, welcome back to our online discernment retreat. I'm Brother John Mark Falkenhayn, Vocation Director for St. Meinrad Arch Abbey. I'm back in the chapter room today for our third conference in front of one of the murals in the chapter room depicting the good works of monks. This one is about keeping death daily before your eyes. That may seem a little bit morbid, but you'll see how it ties in a little bit later. I'm going to begin with chapter 72 of the Rule of St. Benedict on the good zeal of monks. Just as there is a wicked zeal of bitterness, which separates from God and leads to hell, so there is a good zeal, which separates from evil and leads to God and everlasting life. This, then, is the good zeal which monks must foster with fervent love. They should each try to be the first to show respect to each other, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body or behavior, and earnestly competing in obedience to one another. No one is to pursue what he judges better for himself, but instead what he judges better for someone else. To their fellow monks they show the pure love of brothers, to God, loving fear, to their abbot, unfeigned and humble love. Let them prefer nothing whatever to Christ, and may he bring us all together to everlasting life. Today I want to talk in this conference about divine providence and opportunities for holiness, and to use this little reflection to think more about how we discern what our vocation is. In our last conference, we talked about the vows. We talked about obedience and stability and conversatio morum, or fidelity to the monastic life. And we talked about these as a tripod that supports our whole goal of our Christian life, and our monastic life in particular, our whole goal of conversion, of becoming every day the most Christ-like person that we can be. I want to link this to vocations by beginning to tell you about an experience that I had several years ago working at a local hospital. I'm a psychologist, so I worked for a number of years doing therapy with kids and with couples and with adults. And at one time in my professional career, I had a number of young couples come in to see me, maybe about 3 or 4, all at the same time. And they were all presenting with the same basic issue. Each of the couples were about 5, 6, 7 years into their marriage. And their question coming in was, they were wondering why they just weren't as happy as they were when they first got married. And they all thought, you know, we're just not happy like we were. And we think that maybe it's time to hang it up. Maybe it's time to end the marriage. Maybe we really weren't supposed to be married in the first place. And I remember thinking to myself, although I tried to find a better way to say this to them, I remember thinking to myself, happy, that's the criteria upon which you're going to base whether or not your marriage is successful or not, or whether you should be married, whether you're happy. I remember it was also a time when I was discerning my solemn vows in the community. And I remember thinking to myself, is happiness really the criteria that we are supposed to be using for whether or not we are in a vocation that's the right vocation for us? Will I be happy? Really, the better question ends up being, and I say this to our monks in formation all the time, the question isn't whether you're happy, it's important to be happy, but the more basic and important question is this a life? Is this a relationship, a vocation? Is this a covenant that really holds out the promise of conversion for me, of future growth, of becoming as Christ-like as I can? In other words, is this the vocation in which I can truly lay down my life and imitate Christ? Now, what does this mean in everyday life? What does it mean for a married couple? What does it mean for a monk? What does it mean for us to lay down our lives? It means that we are willing to set aside pieces of our identity that are important to us. It means a willingness to serve other people, especially when we don't necessarily feel like it or feel like we have the energy or the gifts. It means having an understanding that the community that I join or the person that I married is not going to be perfect, and I have to accept that about them. It also means having a realistic fear that once I get into this life, that it's going to be difficult, and that difficult things might be asked of me, and that I'm supposed to, with all of my might, try to do the difficult things that are going to be asked of me. Sometimes I think that we're ready for a vocation, or our readiness is improved when we've had an experience of suffering already, when we're familiar with disappointment, or we're familiar with some defeat, or familiar with loss, because then we come to this vocation, or we come to this relationship with a recognition that I've been disappointed in the past, I've had difficult things to deal with in the past, and these will continue in my life, and I know that these experiences, these hardships at times, can really call something greater out of me, a greater generosity, a greater trust in God. And if we have had a little bit of that experience, it means that we come expecting that that's going to continue in the vocation that we choose. Why? Well, again, because our life, our vocation, really is not about finding a place where we're going to be happy or comfortable, or where we're going to find peace, or where things are going to be easier or perfect, but rather it's about finding a place where there are going to be opportunities for holiness. Where holiness involves laying down one's life, giving oneself away, dying to oneself, spending ourselves lavishly, spending all we have on God and the people to whom we commit our lives. That's where our vocation is. I'd like to tell you a story and then give you a definition of holiness that I think will put a sharper point on what we're talking about. Several more years ago, I was working in a pediatric hospital before I joined the monastery. And I did lots of evaluations of children who had developmental delays, who were being placed in foster care by the state, who were planning their future. And one day, had a very interesting and rather sad case come in. It was a 19-year-old boy and his single mother who lived in the inner city, didn't have a whole lot of resources available to them. And this 19-year-old boy was profoundly retarded. He had grown up with extreme birth complications, and so he was now 19. He had a history of aggression. He had very, very limited intellectual skills, and my job was to help evaluate this child and plan for the next step of his future as an adult. He came in with his mother, and she too seemed fairly limited to me. She was a single mother, she was rather poor, and I remember judging myself, how could she possibly handle this very large, difficult to raise son? And so I went out and I got an IQ test, and we couldn't get a floor for him. And so I went out and got the child IQ test, and still he couldn't get any items right. I eventually went down to an infant test. This is how poor his functioning was. And I was ready to throw up my hands thinking, how could this mother ever possibly do what she needs to do for this child? When I walked back into my office with the next test in my hand, and I walked in on that mother, kind of stroking this giant kid's arm, and she was saying to him, "Bobby, you're being so good. You're being so good, Bobby. You're Mama's big, beautiful boy. You're being so good." And I remember being frozen in my tracks, thinking, what a marvelous thing, and feeling so humbled and almost ready to cry, moved to tears. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was that had moved me so much at that time. Several years later, after I joined the monastery, we were reading a book in our monastic refectory on the future of monastic life. And in one of the chapters, there was a little quote by James Deschene, in which he was talking about holiness. And this is the definition of holiness that he offered. He said that, and this is a bit paraphrased, but he said that holiness is fidelity to one's state in life. And then he breaks it out further. He says it's an active fidelity in that we do all we can to accomplish what's required of us. And then it's a passive fidelity in that we accept and suffer with love all that divine providence sends us. Let me repeat it. That holiness is about fidelity to one's state in life, an active fidelity in that we do all we can to accomplish what is required of us, and then a passive fidelity insofar as we accept and suffer with love all that divine providence sends us. It helped me to realize what moved me so much in seeing that mother was that she was a true image of holiness. Now, someone might think that Providence had been cruel to that mother by sending her a profoundly retarded, aggressive son. But it occurred to me that Providence had made her holy, that she had stuck her whole life with a difficult son by herself with so few rewards, but she had accepted and suffered with love what Providence had sent her. It's an amazing thing. Sometimes we see holy cards, and I think the images on holy cards are often there because they make us want to be holy. But if we really put on a holy card the things that make us holy, we would probably just run away. If that mother had been asked, would you like to have this experience of raising a profoundly retarded son, my guess is she would have said, no thanks. But she hung in there. She stayed put. She stayed faithful to her state of life, and she accepted and suffered with love what Providence had sent her. This was truly a remarkably holy woman. This is what we're after, this kind of holiness. This is the vision of our Christian life, to spend our lives being faithful to our state of life. When it comes to discernment, we have to choose something. We have to choose a state of life, and we don't know what's going to come with it. We don't know if a spouse will die. We don't know if we'll end up in a community that will lose its major work. We don't know if we end up in a community with someone that we struggle to like. We don't know what will happen to us. But the call and what will make us holy is if we stay put, if we stay faithful and give the witness of fidelity and lay down our lives for the people who share our life. When we take our solemn monastic vows, we take them in the Abbey Church. And there's a point in the ceremony, in the liturgy, when we lay down on the floor of the Abbey Church. We lay prostrate on the floor, lie prostrate on the floor, and we're covered with the funeral pall, the same big, large piece of fabric, the funeral pall that we put over the coffins when we bury our dead monks. And once we're covered with the funeral pall, then the death toll starts to ring in the bell tower. Boom! Every 15 seconds. And all the while, the monks are singing a prayer, a litany of prayer, over those who are about to take their solemn vows. And then once that's done, the pall is lifted up and the monks come up as the cantor sings, "Awake, arise to a new life." We call this the mystical burial. It's a symbol that we are dying in order to be born into a new life in Christ, and a new life into the monastic life. But in that moment is really the program for all of the monastic life, that we're supposed to spend our life as monks and our life as Christians, even as parents, as husbands and wives, laying down our lives and dying to ourselves, every day giving more of ourselves away, giving up our will, so that the lives of others may be better, the lives of others may be eased, that we can imitate Christ and be more and more in a right relationship with God. It's about pursuing holiness. I want to leave you with a couple of questions in light of this. First of all, what is it that is impelling you towards a vocation? Is it just looking for a place to land where you can be happy and be comfortable? Or rather, are you looking for a place where you can lose yourself and lay down your life and die to self? Secondly, of the choices you're looking at in your discernment, how will that particular life require you to die a little to yourself daily? What are the things that you will have to give up? What are the parts of your will that you may have to sacrifice? In other words, what are the difficult things that may be asked of you? And can you see yourself doing that? And can you see, in other words, opportunities for holiness in the life that you're considering? This mural says, mortem quotidiae ante oculos suspectam habere. To always keep death daily before your eyes. It seems morbid if we think that a monk walks around thinking all the time about death. But really, we could be thinking about this as to keep death daily before your eyes is to look every day in our Christian vocation, our monastic vocation, for ways, opportunities for holiness, for ways that we die to ourselves, that we hand our life over as Christ does, to keep death daily before our eyes.